Hi, I'm Jess Dixon, and I've been working at ClearEdge for just over a year and a half. And the past 9 months, I've been doing front-end development using React. And I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to kind of what React is and the basic components. So what is React? React is an open source JavaScript library and framework for building user interfaces, and more specifically for single page applications. And it is actually the most used JavaScript front end framework since 2016. And it was created by Facebook and released as an open source project in 2013. It was actually heavily influenced by another Facebook project, XHP. And a brief history of React. It kind of all started in 2011. Facebook was having issues with code maintenance, and as their developing team kind of grew, they were facing a lot of issues with cascading updates, so they kind of needed a solution for that. So they had an early prototype of what now became React. In 2012, as Facebook acquired Instagram, it became more of a push to make that project open source, and that came into fruition in 2013. And then a couple of years later, in 2015, it was becoming more stable, more heavily used. Redux was released, which is a JavaScript library for managing global state within React. React Native was released, and you started to see the first stable version of React developer tools in Chrome. So why use React? Mostly because it's easy. It's fast, scalable. You don't have to use any templates, and it combines markup with the corresponding logic, so it's easy to read and understand in your code. And they have client-side rendering, which makes it nice. And everything's component-based, which we'll talk about soon, which just makes everything organized and compartmentalized. So one cool thing about JavaScript is JSX, which is basically just a syntactic sugar in JavaScript, and it produces React elements, and within that you can use embedded JavaScript expressions and logic just within your code. So you can use it. So like here is an example. Here are some examples. Here you have a JavaScript function just embedded in your code just within curly braces. And here's like a conditional in this example over here. And one nice thing about JSX is it also prevents injection attacks. So another cool thing about JavaScript is how they render their elements. React DOM kind of manages how everything is rendered, but it only updates the DOM when absolutely necessary. So like when a state changes is when you'll see the DOM change. And over here is an example. You see all the code and just the time is changing when needed. So as I was saying earlier, React is component-based, which allows you to have a real separation of concerns. You basically want to split up your UI into small, independent, and reusable pieces. And you do that with components. So in your app, you usually start with an app component, and then if you look at that, within your app component, you'll have other like subcomponents. You might have like a nav bar, a map per se, panels, and then within those you'll have other React components like buttons and just like small pieces that you can reuse, which makes it easier to update certain pieces of code without having everything be affected. And components will accept read-only inputs called props, and then it will return a React element. There's two different types of components. There's class-based components and functional components. I have up an example of each. Down here is an example of a class-based component. It basically just extends the React component class, and then in your render function, you will return the React element, whereas with the functional component, which is seen above, that is like a JavaScript function, and then you will return your React element. And then when you go to call that component, you will use this format below, which is just using the component class name as your tag name and then passing through the props. It's very easy to use, and then you'll just call that in your parent component. The class-based components are kind of being phased out because they don't have the ability to use React hooks, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So it's preferable to use the React functional components, but in most applications you'll still see a lot of the class-based components because the hooks are a newer thing. So now we're going to talk a little bit about state and those hooks that I mentioned earlier. State is very similar to props, except for they're completely controlled by the component. They're local to the component. Other components don't know about what's going on with a certain component state. And the state is handled differently between class and functional components, which is one of the reasons why class components are kind of phasing out. But with a class component, what you're going to do is you're going to establish your state using this .state in your constructor, and then you'll update it using this .setState throughout your code. And then to manage lifecycle, they have component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount, which are functions that will just be called when those different things happen. So when your application first renders, when that component's being rendered, you'll have the component did mount function will run, and then when certain variables are changed, then you'll see the component did update function will run and make changes to your component. Functional components do this a little bit differently. They use hooks. The two most popular hooks are the state hook and the use effect hook. The state hook is how you create and manage your local state within your functional components, and basically with this you'll have your state name and then the name of your function that will change that state, and you'll just set it, initialize it here, and then you can use it throughout your component. With use effect, that's more like component did mount and component did update, where it will run basically when the component first renders, and then it will also run whenever certain variables that are passed through that use effect hook are changed, then that function will be called again. And this is preferable to the class component ways, but it's a lot newer, so it was only introduced in 2019, so everything's kind of still transitioning into using this a lot more than they used to. So basically, summing up, React is an open source JavaScript framework for UIs. One cool thing about React is you could use it for your entire app or just one small part of it. It's not an all or nothing thing. So if you just want to use one React component in your application, you can, or you can go all out and do the whole thing. React only updates the DOM when necessary on state changes just for that single component, so you don't have constant re-rendering of your app. JSX is syntactic sugar that makes React easier to use and understand. And then the biggest thing is that React is component-based, so you can break your application down into small reusable pieces. You don't have to repeat yourself, and you have a separation of concerns. Here are my references. Any questions?